Thanks very much, John, and thanks, Alex. That was very enlightening. And thanks, Alan, and the guys at CitA for asking me to speak here today. I suppose when I was looking at the agenda, I knew that Alex was going to give us a big picture on the overall, I suppose, digital construction landscape in the UK, and I knew Pat was going to give a practitioner's approach. And my title sounds very empowering and very exciting, but unfortunately I'm going to focus for a little bit on the valley of death, which Alex was describing. And I think Alex is describing the chasm between coming up with a policy and executing that policy. And I think while I look at this here, we've got leadership, standards, education and training and procurement. One of the things that kind of feeds through all of this is people. And I'm going to talk a little bit about behaviour today, because to come up with any strategy that's going to be effective, you have to consider human beings. Okay, so one of the things which John alluded to, we're a building certification firm. I3PT, I founded I3PT back in 2010, and I think the core reason for setting up the company was to deliver better buildings, and we do that through review and inspection of design and construction. Okay, from a very early stage, it became obvious that had to be a digital journey, and we could see where things were going. And in many respects, I3PT is the love child of three passions of mine, which are construction, technology, and sociology. Okay, so just to give a brief overview, for the first part of the presentation, I'm going to focus very more on the why, I guess, technology and behavioural change, and the link between those two things. The importance of moral engagement in industry, and I'm going to focus on moral disengagement and how that occurs, because we've had some issues with that in the past, and lessons from other sectors. And then very briefly at the end, I'm just going to talk about the how and some of our experiences, and I'll jump into that in a moment. So just to frame the presentation, one of the first things I want to make a point about is, irrespective of the level of genius attributable to any technological change and or innovation, the greatest factor in the success or failure of any initiative is people. Okay, so we can have incredible leadership, great standards, wonderful technology, and none of those things are really a challenge, I think, to the delivery of a roadmap like this. But human beings and their behaviour, to a large extent, will dictate whether or not something will be a success or a failure. So unless we can fine-tune our understanding of human beings and what drives their behaviour, we'll fail to deliver. Thank you. We'll fail to deliver the governance and leadership required to realise the potential of the innovation itself. Okay. So, so I guess, why should companies focus on behaviour, and at a micro level, why should we care about this kind of thing? We all understand the benefits of investing in technology. Most of our companies have seen something of a technological revolution. The term cloud computing or cloud technology is now ubiquitous. You no longer need to say it. So we've seen a quiet revolution in technology in companies over the last while, and the investment in technology is understood. But why should companies focus on behaviour? I guess Gallup Research did a pretty large research project, and they found that companies that apply the principles of behavioural economics outperform their peers by 85% in sales growth and 25% in gross margin. So they tend to be more successful in terms of their growth, and they tend to be more profitable in the long run. Okay, they understand people better. Nonetheless, many organisations still take a technology-first approach, and this can be an error. Okay, so one, in my view, doesn't go very well without the other. I suppose with a deeper understanding of what makes people tick, technology and business leaders make better technology decisions. We create more meaningful digital transformations, engaging experiences, and valuable disruptions. The concept of disruption is often kind of portrayed, it's an overused term, but it's portrayed in a positive light more often than not. We hear about disruptive technology and disruptive companies and how good that all is. Disruption is only good if people latch onto it in the right way. And if people were to latch onto modern methods of construction, for example, the very thing that makes it a benefit, the repeatable, the repeatable nature of what you're doing, it works very well if you're doing it correctly at the outset. But if the culture and the behaviours and the training and the standards that we deploy in offsite manufacturing are not robust, then failures become inherent in the process, and those failures become an epidemic. They become a major issue. Okay, so the disruption is only a positive thing if it's dealt with correctly. So with a view to that, I'm going to talk about behavioural design for a moment. And behavioural design, by definition, it marries behavioural economics and human-centred design. People like Apple do this incredibly well. Okay, so we look at behavioural economics, just to give a very brief overview of behavioural economics. It's a relatively recent, well, this was not recent, but there's been an awful lot more study of behavioural economics since the financial crash. People look an awful lot more about how people make decisions in terms of economics, not just in terms of your how you spend your own money in terms of how governments spend. And traditional economic theory is based on the idea that we're all rational. So when we walk into a shop to buy a television, we look at it and we say, okay, well, the wall in my home is 12 feet wide by 9 feet tall. I can logically fit a 32-inch TV there. Whereas most people walk in and say, well, that's a 65-inch television. How am I going to justify this? And they work back from that. Okay, so a lot of people don't use rational, logical, mathematical type decision making when they come to make decisions about how they spend money. So it explores the entire decision making process with an eye to factors that affect individual choices. And as such, this helps increase the likelihood that new products or technologies will be adopted. And this was looking at digital construction and bringing it back to that. The idea of self and kinship is a big factor here. So the person's sense of self, individually and socially. How does this reflect on me? Okay, there's a big issue in digital construction with the sense of self and kinship. I think there's a multi-tiered system when you look at construction. There's a whole subsection of the construction industry that feels that digital construction is not something that belongs to them. And we talked about taxonomy a moment ago. In terms of crossing the chasm and actually getting the real benefits that we want to get out of digital construction, we have to be able to relate technology and these processes to everybody in the construction project, not just the design teams and the clients to an extent. Expectations, you could also read this to be biases, okay, the attitudes and the presumptions that people bring from previous experiences. And we'll talk about biases a little bit later on, but people have been constructing since long before the pyramids, okay? And certainly people we're dealing with on a daily basis have been constructing for decades without any of this stuff. So why do I need it now? Okay, you have to be able to address those questions, and you can't just dismiss them, okay? Influences, the social norms and cultural forces that shapes a person's beliefs. And I use the word beliefs instead of ideas, okay? Beliefs are much stronger than ideas. There's a great saying I once heard where somebody said people will do anything for their beliefs except think about them. And I think that applies to construction as well. In terms of social norms and cultural forces, even different disciplines within construction have those types of challenges. There are social norms and cultural influences that are unique to mechanical and electrical because of the history of how that's worked in Ireland, for example. And again, for this to be effective and for technology to be effective, for it to be fully endorsed and adopted, that needs to be factored in. Framing, and this is a big one, the resonating focus. How do you frame the discussion around this? When you talk to a client, there's one conversation about digital construction. When you talk to a subcontractor on the ground, it should be a very different conversation. Okay, you need to frame it in a way that they can see the benefits of that. And time distortion is a big one, and this is something that everyone in this room should understand, because we regularly have to make a pitch to a client about the benefits of investing in digital construction and digital technology at the outset. And the time distortion is the way in which people overvalue the present and poorly understand the future. So when you're building something that's going to be on this planet for an awful lot longer than potentially you are, you should be making investments at the present that would benefit the building in the long run. We all understand that, but we make decisions and people make decisions that are contrary to that, back to the behavioural economics point. Barriers and enablers, situations which hinder or empower the ability to make choices or reach goals. So what are the inhibitors here? What are the things that are going to stop people from actually adopting and running with these things? And primarily, it is going to be things like culture in terms of inhibitors or barriers. It's going to be things like large investment in hardware. It's going to be things like training in terms of enablers. It will be things like leadership from government. It will be things like funding. It will be things like subsidising and helping people to get trained up in this stuff and supporting our third level institutes. Okay, and without these things, again, technology will not be adopted. And I suppose in terms of experience, the structure and sequencing of key interactions and what we're seeing here is putting a plan in place for that. So I suppose by combining the principles of behavioural economics and user insights and business context, okay, organisations can more systematically mitigate the risks of introducing these technologies and products and solutions. And indeed, this approach has driven some of the greatest disruptions in the consumer marketplace. So we've seen an awful lot of big changes in recent years. People like Amazon who've disrupted the retail space, Amazon Prime with television and Netflix. So, you know, and speaking about these things is not alien to what we're doing. We just heard Alex speak about it a moment ago. The very same people who consume these products and use these products are the people we're dealing with every day. And if we can make life easier in the same way that these products and these new evolutions have made life easier, then we're much more likely to get buy-in. Okay? So it's not alien to us. So moral disengagement in industry. In our specific business, which is we're in the business of managing and trying to mitigate construction defects primarily. I3PT does two things, by the way. We do that, which is building certification, and we also write software. So we've been writing software for a number of years, for 7 to 8 years now. Principally, the process was designed around managing our own quality management systems and this defect management and inspection and certification process. But over the years, that's grown quite a bit, and it's taken on something of a life of its own. But over the course of this journey, we looked a lot at moral disengagement. Okay, and when you look at construction defects and the types of things that we're now dealing with today in defective buildings, the things we've seen in the news over the last number of years, at some point along the way, there has been moral disengagement in most of those scenarios. Okay, and I want to just talk about a little bit of analysis and diagnosis of the types of things that need to be present for moral disengagement to happen in industry before we can actually think about how you can overcome those challenges. So, psychological theories of morality focus heavily on moral thought and not so much on moral conduct. Okay, so when we think about morality, we think more about how we think about things and less so about our actions. And that's interesting because people suffer from the wrongs done to them irrespective of how the perpetrators might justify their actions. When we were setting up the company, we did some initial research. We were looking to get quite a lot of funding from people like Enterprise Ireland. We did a lot of research around building defects, and we met people who would have been involved in projects such as West Prairie Hall, which is very topical here at the time, and a number of other significant construction defects in Canada and New Zealand and other areas. And we spoke with subcontractors, we spoke with clients, we spoke with a host of other stakeholders. And one thing was quite common throughout: it was never their fault. Nobody ever saw that their actions had resulted in the failures. And I can remember at one point having a really good interview with a subcontractor who'd been involved in installing passive fire systems. It was drywall, or plasterboard arrangements. And when we asked him what was wrong, he told us that the developer was a bad guy. There was problems with the design. There was this, there was that. By the way, his boss was actually a pretty bad guy as well. And we said at the end of the interview, always at the end, because it usually brought the interview to a close very quickly, to what extent do you feel responsible? He said, what do you mean? We said, to what extent were you responsible for the failure? I mean, your boss didn't pick up a hammer on site. The developer didn't pick up a hammer on site. You were the guy there delivering the work. And it ended the interview very quickly. It was alien to them, right? So, but what I did find was, in essence, the vast majority of human beings wish to view themselves as good people. We like to be able to look in the mirror in the morning, okay? We like to be able to say, we're good people. We do things for moral reasons. But the extent to which we self-regulate behavior varies depending on whether or not we choose to activate our moral agency. So there's times when we choose not to. There's times when we turn a blind eye, okay? And really I want to talk about that a little bit. So there are many social and psychological maneuvers by which moral self-sanctions can be disengaged from one's conduct, and this moral disengagement can be conscious or subconscious. We either know we're doing it sometimes and sometimes we don't. So just to delve into that, moral justification is one of the first things I want to talk about. And this occurs when people engage in reconstruction of the behaviour itself. Okay, people don't ordinarily engage in harmful conduct until they've justified it to themselves and the morality of their actions. So I'm going to do something here, but you know, I'm doing this because I'm working in a team, and we have to get this job over the line. Behavioural economists, there's a guy called Dan Ariely, an Israeli guy. He's worth looking up. Dan Ariely did a lot of research on this. He found people cheat about 4 times as much in teams. Okay, they're much more likely to do something that's contrary to their moral code when they work in teams. Everything in construction is built around teams for the common good. Okay, you can do an awful lot of things for the common good. Alex mentioned a moment ago accountability and the transparency that digital construction brings. Okay, and that's a really, really key thing here. And that's one of the lessons we learned is individual accountability is huge. Okay, it makes it more difficult to morally justify certain actions. And in the process of this moral justification, the action itself can be maybe personally and socially acceptable by portraying it as serving a socially worthy cause. One of the things that came up through the research we did on the building defects and speaking to subcontractors and designers and other people was this thing of, when all else failed, I had to keep my job. I had to put food on the table. Okay, that's a very, very strong driver. You can pretty much justify anything for your family. So you just need to really drill into this if you want to make people change. People can act on moral imperative and preserve their view of themselves as a moral agent while inflicting harm when they do this. And it's often present in warfare, okay, which we'll talk a little bit about again in a moment. There's a little bit of an unhealthy relationship between military and company strategy and how we speak and think about companies these days. But you know, some of the some of the things that are present there, but it also happens in industry. And Voltaire had a great quote about this. He said, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." Okay, and I suppose that's quite extreme. He was talking about war. It's very relevant today to all of us in terms of the current political climate and everything else. But this also applies on a macro level. If you're working for a company where you are being led to believe that there's a moral imperative, there's something you have to do for the team that will get you over the line, it's a minimum viable approach, you can justify an awful lot. And we saw a lot of this probably in the last boom. Euphemistic labeling, okay? People think in words, and vocabulary is very important. We talked about taxonomy a moment ago. Language does shape our thought patterns, okay? And they're the thought patterns on which our actions are based. Activities take on a very different appearance depending on what they're called. And we hear the sanitization of language all the time now in the news. We don't even notice it anymore. If you hear about somebody bombing a village in a remote region of the world, we now hear generals talking about clean surgical strikes. It invokes an imagery of something almost healthy. Okay, it's dangerous stuff. Friendly fire sounds like a fine thing, you know. Even practical completion in our industry has come to mean something very different to what it really means. We've seen practical completion on buildings that are anything but practically complete. Okay, so language is important, and we use language in construction increasingly to distance ourselves from the immoral part of that, which might be money, or it might be getting something over the line with a client, but we use an awful lot of our own acronyms and our own language now. So not surprisingly, euphemistic language is widely used to make harmful conduct respectable and to reduce personal responsibility for that. And people sanitize that behaviour by giving it a nicer sounding label. Advantageous comparison was one of the biggest ones we came across, and this is another way of making harmful conduct look good. Okay, how behaviour is viewed is coloured by what it's compared against. I was lucky enough growing up to have my younger brother was a complete tearaway, right? So whatever he did, I could turn to my parents and say, "Last week Michael did this," and it gave me an advantageous comparison. So my parents came to the view that I was actually the okay one, you know, and I got away with murder, you know. And actually, that's something we do in our own lives, but we also do it in industry quite a lot. Phrases like "this is common practice," that covers all manner of sins. Common practice covers all manner of sins. Everybody does this. You should see what our competitors do, you know. That's the kind of thing we hear all the time, right? And it's very dangerous. It seems harmless, but it's quite dangerous. Displacement of responsibility is a big one. And again, it goes back to that previous research I discussed. So moral control operates most strongly when people acknowledge that they cause harm by their own actions. Okay? People will behave in ways that they normally repudiate if legitimate authority accepts responsibility for their effects of their conduct. One thing I'd ask you to Google if you get a chance at a later date, we don't have time to go through it, but it's Milgram's obedience study, and it goes to this thing of displacement of responsibility. It's kind of like the Nuremberg defense. I was just following orders. Okay? People will do all kinds of things if there's a perceived authority that will take responsibility, and construction projects are full of perceived authority. So, under this displaced responsibility, people view their actions as stemming from the diktats of an authority rather than them being responsible for themselves. Firms can authorize immoral actions without direct authorization. Okay, so rarely will you see a firm assume responsibility open for this kind of stuff. In many cases, they remain consciously uninformed. Get it done ASAP. We need you on another site, right? I've not told you to cut corners, but you have told me that you need another 3 weeks, and I've told you you've got 1. Okay, I don't really care. I don't want to know. Just get it done. Move on. You're needed on the other side. In the context of the current skills shortage, this one we should be thinking about a great deal. What are the leaders of the companies that we're employing on site saying to their staff? Okay, because if this occurs again, because it did occur before, we had a skills shortage and a massive increase in construction activity at more or less the same time before, it can be a big problem. Okay, so one of the things we do with technology as much as possible is we try to make it the responsibility of the man on site, the person that they've put on site. We try to make that link between their moral duties and what they have to do on this project. Diffusion of responsibility, again, personal agency. So this is different from displacing it, it's diffusion. We're sharing it now. Okay. Personal agency gets obscured by diffusing personal accountability. There are several ways of doing it, right? But a sense of responsibility can be diffused and thereby diminished by division of labour. This is a direct quote from an excellent academic paper which I'll share with Alan afterwards for distribution. But construction is based almost entirely around the division of labour. Okay, it's inherent in what we do. Group decision making is another common practice that gets otherwise considerate people to behave inhumanely. I talked about cheating in teams. when everyone is responsible, nobody feels responsible. And this is particularly rife in construction, the kind of copy everybody, the CC everybody culture, copy 25 people, and hopefully I can get out of the problem myself. I can shift the blame around somewhere here. And the very nature of subcontracting itself lead to a natural diffusion of responsibility. Okay, who is holding the live round in this firing squad? We're not quite sure. Okay. And somebody recently described to me, he was working on an oil rig in a construction project. He described working on an oil rig construction project as like flying an airplane where everybody's got a set of controls, which is a really scary thought, right? But construction projects are a little bit like that. You just need one person to make a failure. And more often than not, it's not structural. It's not one of the really, really big ticket items that we're all concerned about. It'll be a minor detail. It'll be a subcontractor who fails to do something, but he fails to do it again and again and again and again. Okay, and that's the type of thing which in modern methods of construction is a problem, but also if a specific construction detail is missed, it can become a big challenge. So, I suppose disregard or distortion of consequences, and again, briefly on this one, this is when people pursue activities that are harmful to others for personal gain, but they try to convince themselves that it's not actually that serious. And this was one that came up in the research as well, was people saying, actually, look, we spoke to an architect of a building that was condemned for fire safety reasons. And he still maintained, even though it had been reviewed and had been shut down and effectively had to be evacuated, he still maintained the building was fine. There was nothing wrong with that building. There was absolutely nothing wrong with that building. The regulations are mad. Okay? So you can disregard or distort the consequence of the outcome. What I did there was nothing wrong with that. Okay? So this availability bias is a big thing as well. Biases are everywhere, but availability bias is particularly challenging in construction because we don't have seismic activity, because we don't have a very hot climate, we don't have that many catastrophic building failures. Okay, and we also have a good education platform. We also have good rites of passage for construction professionals. But also you do get this thing where people say, well, I've delivered countless buildings and I've never had a problem, right? Why would this be a problem now? So there is another major issue in the industry, and it speaks to that time distortion thing we talked about previously. So, and the final one in terms of moral disengagement is this idea of dehumanization, and that's where somebody can dehumanize the victim or the person who's going to be affected by the failure. And this happens quite a lot with projects where we've seen people vilify the client, the contractor, the architect, their own boss, whomever they choose to dehumanize. It makes it much easier to disengage from your own moral code. The client didn't pay for quality, so we couldn't deliver a good job. We've heard that before. The bloody architect designed it wrong, and I'm only paid to build what he's designed. That's another one we come across almost daily. Okay, so if you can put somebody in a position, if you can pigeonhole them and say, well, that guy's a bad guy, I couldn't do a good job, then you can do all kinds of things. So what we're talking about here is we work in an industry where it's possible for somebody to not feel any responsibility for what they do. And that's a challenge for all of us. And the next stage of this, I guess, is to look at how we can learn, as Alex alluded to earlier, from other industries. Okay, medicine, for example, simple checklists were introduced in recent years for central line infections, which save thousands of lives every year in the US. There's a guy called Atul Gawande. He wrote a great book called The Checklist Manifesto. If anyone's interested in this kind of stuff, it's a great book to read. And he's a surgeon, but he did a huge amount of research around how to prevent the types of preventable failures in hospitals. That in the US, for example, 2 million people a year leave hospital with an infection they didn't come in with. Okay, 2 million people a year. 98,000 people per year die from preventable healthcare disasters in operations. And this guy looked at it and he did a lot of work around looking at the cause of some of these failures, central line infections being one of the biggest causes of infections. And he looked at it and he developed a 5-step checklist for central line infections, which reduced the number of deaths in some of the hospitals in South Carolina, I think it was, by about 98%. Okay, deaths from central line infections are very sick patients. If you contracted a central line infection and you were already quite sick, you'd have about an 80% chance of being killed by that. Okay, and it was a simple 5-step checklist. This is quite relevant to us because medicine, like construction, has evolved to have I suppose a multidisciplinary team of super specialists. There used to be a time when there was a master builder. He was the architect, he was the engineer, he was the guy you went to with everything. But over time we've evolved to having super specialists. The architect now has a sub-consultancy, a sub-consultant for fire safety, potentially for a facade, depending on the project. We're increasingly becoming more and more specialised because we're surrounded by extreme complexity. And what Atul Gawande has spent an awful lot of time looking at is this idea of, in an age of extreme complexity, how do we navigate that? How do we use simple tools, simple technologies to improve things? And he helped to develop a 19-stage checklist with the World Health Organization that reduced preventable deaths in the Netherlands by 47% in hospitals, preventable deaths, and also in the US, I think 33%. So very briefly, the health and fitness industry, this idea of the quantified self, wearable technologies is a big advance. Everything is measured from food to exercise to sleep, and that's been a big advance in terms of how consumers use technology. Energy and utilities, we're much more aware of the energy consumption we have and what drives that, and I think people are using that type of thing to make better decisions about how we run our buildings. Video conferencing has changed the patterns of work, and e-commerce, as we mentioned earlier, has driven huge changes in consumer behaviour. And again, the reason I mention these is that these are relevant to the people who are operating in our industry every day. But we need to connect them to the benefits of our technology without scary acronyms and TMI, too much information. So very briefly, I'm going to run through these quite quickly because we're running late. What we've learned, okay, so in terms of our business, what we've learned from deploying technology for building regulations and quality assurance, your name and lights, the stick. So one of the things we've learned is it's all about accountability. If you can make people individually accountable, it's much more difficult to disengage morally. Okay, it's much more difficult to not to take accountability for what you're doing. Nobody likes to have their name in red lights on the dashboard, and that's one thing we found, even to the extent that when somebody was 1 week overdue on our software when we first developed it, they would go into the red, and they lost their minds about this. So a guy could have delivered 40 inspection reports to the system, and he would be 1 week overdue, and he would get very, very cranky about that. So we changed that to be amber for the first week, and then he goes to red after that. But it's something that people got a little bit of anxiety about, and we found it was possibly a good behavioural driver. Once you get a fair requirement and notify everyone what you're going to track and report on in terms of deliverables, you can achieve small but very significant behavioural changes. One of the things we focused on is collecting records of supervision from site and ensuring that they had photographic evidence to demonstrate that they had actually happened. And that was something that was a small but significant change in the number of defects we discovered over a period of 3 or 4 years. I won't get into this, but we can get into what this software does at a later point. But basically, it manages defects, inspections, and all other quality benchmarks using a very clean and simple traffic light system now. And traffic lights have been very, very effective for us. And the simpler the idea and the cleaner the interface, the more likely people are to adopt it. That was another thing we found. So we've also begun to use data analytics based on Uniclass to extract information and statistics relating to construction defects, and that can tell us which systems were most likely to be found defective across sites. But it also tells us which companies produce the greatest number of defects. We report that back to the companies. Nobody likes to be at the top of that list. Okay? People like to learn from their mistakes because they know that this will be reported to clients. On the carrot side of things, what's in it for me? It's not all about making people comply. So innovations work best when there are clear benefits for all stakeholders. And again, this applies to everything we're doing here. So the initiation of a change effort might be relatively easy to trigger. Alex talked about the balloons coming down and the big announcement. It's not about big events though, right? The consolidation of that change is where the real challenge lies. And it's that constant maintenance of the initiative. Considering the users fully in the system design is a big part of that. If you're asking somebody to adopt a new practice, try to design the process in a manner which will bring efficiencies. One thing we did with that was we brought in a site inspection app for the subcontractors, which we gave them for free. And we wanted to change their behaviour a little bit, so we gave them a gift. And we said, you can use this for free on the projects. The first time we did it was with a very big Northern Irish man who was working on a housing project. He didn't like the look of me one bit. And I said, it's great, we're going to give you an app and you can do all your inspections through that. And he said, I've never used an app in my life, I'm not going to start now. So I said, okay, but what are you doing at the moment? And it turned out that he was emailing himself about 50 photographs a day. He was then handwriting his checklists and he was scanning them and he was emailing those to himself and he was opening a Word document and putting it all together. It was taking about 4 hours every Friday to do it. And we gave him an app that enabled him to do all of that while he walked on site, including his digital checklist. And that was one way of giving him something that benefited him. And effectively treating people with respect and don't allow them to disengage from their moral duties was a big one for us, highlighting the self-valuation aspects of that and get them to focus on that future benefits piece. Very, very briefly, we've discussed the risk of use mislabeling, but there's another risk arising from digital construction, which is the overuse of acronyms and complex language, which makes it inaccessible. We kind of need to hide the BIMness of it all. okay, in order for people to really buy into it at times. And many stakeholders do not relate to BIM or digital construction. There's a sense of otherness. When we speak to people on the ground, that's not for me, that's for somebody else. Okay? And sadly, unless this changes, the sectors of our industry which could benefit most from the features of these new technologies are the ones least likely to adopt it fully. Very briefly on this one, it's behavioural change begins with the procurement practice, and I think when we're talking to clients, we need to give them a level of detail which is useful. Sometimes we've worked on a series of projects which were BIM level 2 or supposed to be, but the client didn't really quite understand why they'd gone for BIM level 2. They didn't really know what they needed to do for it to work and how it would benefit the building during the construction project over its life cycle. So if the message was tailored and better, I think they would, if it was more focused on the benefits rather than the features, I think it would have been more powerful. And then the client would be better able to support the maintenance of the process throughout the project, which is where it usually falls down. So closing comments, it's currently a huge opportunity to change and improve the culture in our industry. Technology has a huge role to play in this, and many companies are doing incredible work in this field. But in order for it to be as effective as it could be, we need to place as much emphasis on people as we do in the technology itself. And as leaders in the space, all the people in this room, there's a responsibility on everybody to make it as accessible and as relatable as possible to all industry stakeholders, especially the ones who feel it's not for them. Okay, that's me. Thanks, guys.